Hello, everyone. A big welcome from Singapore. My name is Juliana Chan, and I'm the founder of the Singapore-based Wildtype Media Group. We are the publishers of Asia's leading science magazine, asianscientist.com, and you can find us in print, online, and on social media. I am very excited to be talking today with the one and only Michele Wucker, political commentator and policy analyst, and the author of the best-selling The Gray Rhino, which discusses high probability risk we often seem to ignore. So to provide some background, Michele began as a financial journalist before joining a think tank. She then went on to start her own Chicago-based strategy firm, Gray Rhino and Company, and she's still based in Chicago today. Michele has received many honors, including being recognized as a Guggenheim Fellow and a Young Global Leader of the World Economic Forum, and that's how I know Michele. Her 2019 TEDTalk, Why We Ignore Obvious Problems and How to Act on Them, has been watched by nearly 2.3 million people. Now that's a lot of eyeballs. In today's chat, I want to learn everything I need to know about Gray Rhino risks and what Gray Rhino events we should anticipate in the future. I'm also very keen to understand individuals and organizations and how we can identify and actually stop a horde of rhinos from stampeding all over us, metaphorically speaking, of course, and how to see opportunities where others do not. By the way, given that my company is called Wildtype Media Group and Michele clearly seems to love wild animals, in particular, a very gray rhino, I'm very sure that we will have a lot in common and a lot to talk about. Wouldn't we, Michele? Let's bring Michele on. Hi, Michele. How are you doing?
Good.
So welcome to our chat today. Now that you're in Chicago, tell us what it is like there. Are you in some form of lockdown or shelter in place? What does it look like there?
So we have a shelter in place order. I'm fairly lucky in that I'm about 5 miles north of downtown, and it's a fairly quiet neighborhood. The post offices and banks and grocery stores are still open, but it's completely changed. They've blocked off part of the section where you normally have a self checkout. They sanitize all of the grocery carts for you. You're required to wear a mask. They've got plexiglass barriers all over everything. People are supposed to stay in place and are stand 6 feet apart. And I've seen in other parts of the U.S. that people don't necessarily respect that, but in the Midwest, people tend to follow the rules. So I'm kind of lucky that way. The biggest problem is that I live right next to the lake.
I see.
And the lakefront has been closed because the first warm day of the year, a bunch of people went out and played volleyball and crowded the lakefront, and we're not social distancing. So the mayor got really mad and shut down the lakefront. And I normally walk. I was so mad at those yuppies who went out, and this is why we can't have nice things. And I'm used to walking along the lake and watching the sunrise every morning, but I can't do that anymore. There's a little park on this side of Lakeshore Drive that unfortunately is now really, really crowded because the lakefront is closed, because we normally have a big park, and now we're squeezed into a little one, which was not what the order was intended to do. So that's my only complaint, and my dog is really upset about that too.
Well, so I guess that's why we're having this chat, because you can't go out to the lake, we have you here today. Now, Michele, you introduced the term the Gray Rhino, and it's really caught fire in all the reports recently, especially right now. But you introduced it a long time ago, in 2013 at the World Economic Forum in Davos to describe a highly probable, high impact yet neglected threat in the financial world. Could you give us like a 101 version and start to what exactly is the Gray Rhino?
So the Gray Rhino was a metaphor to help us to take a fresh look at obvious things, because we're so surprisingly likely to ignore obvious things that we've got the opportunity to protect ourselves from, or head off to a different path. And so it's a rhino because it's big, it's got a horn, which is dangerous, it's coming at you. And I came up with that because I was trying to come up with a way to talk about the difference between the Argentine and the Greek debt crisis. I won't bore you with the details, but basically, you know, Argentina had a chance to deal with its crisis earlier so that it wasn't so chaotic, and they didn't. And Greece actually sat down with its creditors and came up with an agreement. So they both had this big, scary thing coming at them. So that's where the rhino came from. And it's great because I was, as I was talking about this, you know, brainstorming for the book in my office, a friend of mine who's a corporate lawyer made a joke about the black swan. Of course, the highly improbable, high impact thing that became the sort of the metaphor of the 2008 financial crisis, even though it was badly misused. Mm-hmm. It was meant to get people to realize how much more likely than they think they are to get run over by something they can't even picture. But instead, a lot of policymakers and then, you know, portfolio managers who lost money used it as a big cop-out. Oh, nobody saw it coming. Never could have seen it coming. And, you know, so anyway, he made a black swan joke. He says, oh, well, you could call it a black rhino. And all this memory from going to the zoo when I was, you know, in elementary school started coming back. And I thought, wait a minute, there actually is something in real life called a black rhino. But, or wait, isn't there a white rhino? I don't know. Let me go to Wikipedia because I really don't remember much about rhinos. And that's when I realized that this gray rhino was a perfect metaphor. There are 5 rhino species in the wild. One is the black rhino, which is not black. The other is the white rhino, which is not white. They're both gray. So it turned out to be a perfect metaphor for what I was trying to say, which is that there are things that are so obvious that we just refuse to recognize for what they are. And so that's how the gray rhino was born.
Thank you. So, Michele, you know, my magazine is based in Asia, and we are very interested in particular in your work in China. So I really hope you can tell us the story of how exactly did the gray rhino end up on Chinese President Xi Jinping's bookshelf. By the way, before you start, I need to share our screen so that everyone can take a look at the bookshelf, of course. 1 second. There you go. So this was, tell us the story of this annual address and where your book is, if you can even spot it.
You know, I couldn't spot it. The images I had were too small and they pixelated when I blew them up. But the book is a silver with gold lettering. So mm-hmm. Any of it, there's actually, it looks like up on the left-hand side that it looks like it's fatter than my book, but who knows? I have no idea how it got there. I'm very, very happy. So every year there's a New Year's address. And every year the Chinese media goes and looks at all the books on the shelves and tries to come up with, you know, what's new on the shelf. And so on January 2nd, a bunch of friends emailed me and they said, look where your book is. And
there you go, this is the book.
There it is. Yes, it doesn't come across as much on the screen, but it's in person. It's a very silvery, you know, very, very glamorous. But people had told me that he had used it behind closed doors at the National Financial Work Conference in summer of 2017. And I knew that he'd used it in very high-level financial discussions. So, you know, I knew he'd read it, but I was really amazed to see the bookshelf. And you know, they tell you in publishing, you should get a super fan. And I take no credit for getting a super fan, but I'm very, very grateful for the one I have.
I mean, not only is President Xi clearly your fan, even the Chinese central bank has used the gray rhino in their planning. And if I understand correctly, the gray rhino even caused a minor sell-off on the Shenzhen small cap index. Can you tell us more about that? I'm just going to stop the share.
Sure. So it was right after this National Financial Work Conference that I was talking about, a major financial planning meeting where they had talked a lot about gray rhinos, and in the closing remarks, I've seen the video, and it talks about gray rhinos. And so the day after that conference closed, there was a front page editorial above the fold, as we say in the media business. Although I don't know how much longer that term's going to be relevant, since how long are you going to have physical newspapers. But there was an official editorial saying, you need to watch out not just for black swans, but also for gray rhinos. And it listed several financial risk gray rhinos, like the overheated real estate market, too high corporate borrowing, unregulated new internet financial products, shadow banking, potential for market volatility. And so the markets saw that, and they took it as a warning that regulators were going to start cracking down on financial risk, which actually did happen over the following months. And so that's why the shares fell. I think it was by about 5% in a single day. And the funny thing was, I was traveling back from New York as all of this was happening. So I was sort of incommunicado for several hours. And I come back and I open my email box, and there's all these requests for interviews from China. And CNN had a big story, Bloomberg, headlines went all over the world, and I don't know how many languages. But it was pretty amazing. And I went to a cocktail party that night. My friend says, "What did you do today?" Well, I just kind of crashed part of this tiny stock market today. Just another day in the life.
That is a good story, by the way. That's a really good one. But Michele, we use the word the gray rhino as a like a catchphrase almost. But people fail to realize that there's more to it than just a really good name. It is actually a 5-stage strategic framework to describe the various stages of a gray rhino event. Could you maybe walk us through these 5 stages? I can begin with the first stage, which I remembered to be denial. And I know for a fact when something bad happens, the first thing all of us do is to deny it, right? More or less.
Absolutely. Well, I'm so glad that you picked up on that, because it's another difference from the black swan, which there is a book that goes with it, but it's not a framework. It's just you kind of use the word and invest in a tail risk fund, which is I think what the book was meant for. But it is it's really backwards looking. And so the gray rhino is intended to be forward-looking, something you can see in the future. And I thought about, why aren't we dealing with things? And it turns out it depends on which stage of a gray rhino event you're at, because there are different stages where we respond differently. And so there are different strategies for moving forward to the next one. So denial, of course, is the first one. And of course, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross has done such wonderful, wonderful work with the 5 stages of grief. So as soon as I realized denial, I went out and got her book, of course. And some of the stages are sort of loosely inspired by hers, but they take on a life of their own. So denial is what you think it is, and it's actually a very, very human defense mechanism. Like we're hardwired to not absorb scary things all at once, because sometimes if we do, the shock is just too big. I mean, you hear about people who die of broken hearts. Like their denial mechanism was not working properly. So it's there to protect us, but it often malfunctions, and there are people who take advantage of it. There's been a lot of great work on the tobacco industry in the United States, and certainly the fossil fuel industries, taking advantage of the fact that people don't want to hear something that's bad news. And so playing to that. As a way of sort of manufacturing the sense of denial and encouraging people to look away from news that they don't want to hear. So that's denial. The second one is muddling, which is like kicking the can. It's when you say, okay, yes, there's a problem, but here are 4,062 reasons why I can't deal with it. I don't have the resources. Oh, the boss isn't bought in. Oh, there's no political will. Oh, blah, blah, blah. And, in some cases there are real obstacles, but what you want to do is flip that mindset to get into the next stage, which is diagnosing. You go from, here's why we're not dealing with it, to what does it take to deal with the problem? And that includes looking very closely at the gray rhinos in front of you. You need to prioritize. In some cases, there's a gray rhino that you can kind of deal with on its own, but in many cases, there are gray rhinos that are related to each other. So you need to take a systems approach. And interestingly, a group of, or a herd of gray rhinos is called a crash, which is so appropriate. I
Perfect.
wish that translated into other languages as well, because it's just so perfect in
A crash
English.
of rhinos.
A crash of gray rhinos, exactly. So there's an analysis process. Is it a single gray rhino or is it a crash? How big is it? What's the impact? How fast is it coming? It's been interesting to see as people sort of embrace the concept and, add their own personality to it, which I love, by the way. But the definition is very, very simple. It's, obvious, probable, most likely neglected. And they're like, oh, it's off on the savannah, or, oh, it's hiding in the grasses. But the original image was really this thing that's on the road. I mean, like in the book cover in English, it's coming right at you. It's pawing the ground, it's snorting, it's getting ready to charge, and it gives you a choice of what to do. But this question of where is it is relevant to the diagnosing stage. If it's farther away, okay, you've got a little bit more leeway. It's probably going to cost a lot less to deal with it if you do it now when it's still a baby gray rhino. And may I recommend so strongly cute baby rhino videos? Wow. My first book was called Why the Cocks Fight. It had roosters. So I have so many rooster towels and tchotchkes that, people would send me. It's just like too much. So people now send me like pictures of rhinos and gray rhino, baby rhino videos, which I'm completely happy about. They don't really make rhino dish towels, which I've got no problems with because I've got enough dish towels already. But and the other part about diagnosing is, what does it take to solve the problem? Who do you need to do what to solve the problem? If you're in a company, is it your boss? Is it the head of that department who always is just impossible to deal with? What motivates those people? How can you get them on board? And there's, many, many kinds of gray rhinos. You can go to the book for more detail because we'll be here all day if I just talk about that. So that brings us to the fourth stage, which is a little bit related to this question of, how close is it to you? Fourth stage is panic, which is, this sort of sense of urgency. I do a lot of workshops with trade groups and corporations. And in one of them, it was so funny. This guy raised his hand and he says, what if you really weren't paying attention and the first stage is panic? which happens. And in truth, it makes it a lot easier for decision makers to deal with something when it is sudden and does pop up out of the blue, because that creates a different emotional reaction and neurological process. But ideally, you've gone through all these other stages, spending as little time as possible in denial and muddling. What you want to ensure is that by the time you get to this panic stage where everyone's running around and screaming, do something, anything, just do something. I often use the image of the Edvard Munch painting, The Scream, which I used it in a presentation in Norway, and they loved it. But that's the image that always comes into my head. But so that's the time when people are most likely to do something. But if you don't have a good diagnosis and plan and people who are behind it, you are probably going to do the wrong thing. Right. This, financial crisis is such a great example, because you'll have politicians who are trying to overstimulate the economy at the top just to keep the boom going until their term is over, and they don't care if it falls apart when they leave. But when your economy is booming is when you need to be paying down debt. You need to be fiscally responsible. And then, of course, it's on the way down that they decide, oh yeah, I guess we need to pull in our belts, and then that makes the crisis worse. This is a great argument for counter-cyclical policies. And then the final stage is action, which is what it sounds like. Often there are people acting. They're usually these sort of positive mavericks, people who get something early and go out there. Often they have to really stick their neck out to get other people to pay attention to what they're doing. The question is, how do you reward these people? A lot of our societies don't reward people who come out and prevent a problem. So we're not very good at counterfactuals. So this is the thing that didn't happen, so praise them for that. It's really hard to do. So how do you encourage this action? And the other part is that when you're dealing with your own gray rhino, how are you tracking that? How are you checking to make sure that what you did is effective? Because too many people will say, okay, here, this is what I did to solve the problem, and I did something, so wash my hands of it. And, maybe there are unintended side effects, maybe there are other things. So action also involves a process for systematically tracking and adjusting as you need to get the results that you want.
So thank you for giving us the 5-part framework of the Gray Rhino. I want to talk about COVID-19, right in front of us. We are in lockdown because of that everywhere. Is COVID-19 a classic Gray Rhino event? Is it? Because many countries saw it coming, at least from the point where it had an outbreak in Wuhan. But they didn't, many countries went in denial and they didn't even prepare fast enough. I think you know which countries I'm referring to. Is COVID-19 a classic Gray Rhino?
Sure. Well, there's actually a couple ways to look at it. I mean, first of all, pandemics in general are the kind of thing that I call a recurring Gray Rhino. They happen over time periodically. My own great-grandfather died during the Spanish flu epidemic. Oh, I shouldn't call it Spanish because it didn't actually start in Spain. They think it was either France or the US. They're still debating, and I think the Spanish are still a little sensitive about that. So apologies to my friends in Spain for that slip. But this is something that happens, on a regular basis. When I was writing the Gray Rhino, the Ebola outbreak was happening. And it was actually kind of a funny story. I was at a conference in Casablanca and flew back, and I have really bad eyes. And so apparently everyone has these things called PVDs, posterior vitreous detachments, like by the time you're in your 70s. But if you have really bad eyes like I do, you get them much earlier. So anyway, on the way back, I started getting these like flashes in my eyes, and ended up having to go to the emergency room. And there's a big sign in there saying, please let us know if you've been to Africa recently. And so I was like, well, yeah. They said, when do you get back? I said, I think my plane landed about 10 o'clock last night. And my sister said their eyes got so big. But, the truth is, I mean, although, Casablanca was quite far from the source of it, a few weeks later, a woman was flying through there and had it. So, maybe I shouldn't laugh at them as much. But, that happened. I mean, and I was supposed to speak at a conference in Mexico in 2009. Yeah, 2009, when H1N1, the conference got pushed back several months. So we have these things all the time. The World Health Organization had a sort of preparedness report that came out, said the world is not ready. We don't have a good detection and coordination and warning system, that there's so many healthcare systems that are not in good shape. And one of the recommendations that came out of Ebola was that the best way to treat pandemics is the best way to treat all these other diseases. Make sure you have a robust functioning health system where people have access. I mean, with Ebola, there were people who couldn't even get Tylenol or, basic things. So there'd been lots of warnings about the world not being prepared for pandemics. Bill Gates had a fantastic TEDTalk in 2015, lots of scenario planning. In fact, the Trump administration itself had a scenario planning exercise in the first part of last year. So they even had a plan, a blueprint for what to do. And that didn't get high enough. So there has been a lot of work on pandemic preparedness. I mean, some of the research we've been seeing on bats and coronaviruses and other diseases, there's been lots and lots of ongoing research into how to prevent them, and lots of talk about how to make the healthcare systems better, but we weren't where we needed to be. So that was that first part, where it was one of these long-term recurring Gray Rhinos. It was getting some attention, but not enough upstairs. And there's also this dilemma that there are lots of these things that are likely to happen. You want to do the right amount of preparedness. You don't drop everything for one particular one because you don't know which one's going to come first. But I think that in this case, there's a very good argument to be made that the warnings went ignored. So that's the first one. And then the second one was, once this emerged in China, once they sequenced the genome in early January, once the cases started rising, once this really stunning lockdown effort happened in China that everyone in the world was amazed by and had lots of things to say about as well. But the rest of the world was really not fast enough in responding. We've heard stories in the United States about senators and other senior level government officials being briefed in January that this could be a really big problem. And what did they do? They went back and they told their constituents, oh, it's going to be fine. It's just the flu. And then they went and they sold their stocks because, the financial Gray Rhino is a whole other element of this. A lot of people, the smart people on Wall Street, who are the ones that I follow, have been warning that this was a bubble that was getting ready to pop. They went and these same people, bought telemedicine stocks. So there were people who knew and acted for their own benefit, but not for everyone else. And we still, in the United States, waited weeks and weeks and weeks with information once it came out. And, in the very earliest stages of it, China was trying to build the airplane while it was flying it. They didn't have as much information at the beginning as Western countries did. And we blew it. No mask. There's a story that's come out about the early days, US-based mask producers saying, hey, I can switch my production, or they produce other something, whatever it was. But they said, we can switch. There's going to be huge shortage of masks. The mask short pile was short. So many things were not dealt with, even when it was clear that this wasn't one of these rhinos kind of wandering around. This was coming right at us. And it took me back to this nightmare assignment in college. It was a mathematical modeling for social sciences class. And I went to Rice, where there's the SEs, the science and engineering students, and the academics. And I was an academ, but I was taking a lot of the SE courses. And in this one, we were broken up into groups. And I was the only academ in the group. And somehow I ended up doing all the work. And I had the least abilities. And we were doing a modeling of a virus. And, I remember looking at the numbers and going, wow. And I don't think we got a great grade on that, basically because, my skills weren't great and people weren't helping on it. But it's a grade that I was proudest of in all of college because it was really, really, really hard. And I got through anyway.
So, by the way, thanks for the virus modeling story. Michele, now that you mentioned about some of these lapses, at least in the early stages, such as you mentioned the US, why do these leaders and decision makers then do that? I mean, what is the reason that they fail to address early obvious dangers before they spiral out of control? I'm just going to give a few suggestions and tell me if they're all right, or some of them, were they just negligent? I mean, was it just inertia? Was it fear? Or what is it that motivates them? By the way, I also remember a phrase you said once, which was, we reward people for cleaning up messes, not for preventing messes. There are no prizes for preventing a war, is that? But there's always a prize for, winning it.
It's true. It's, it's something that I think a lot of politicians really don't want to have to deal with, and they just hope that they don't. In the United States, there was gross negligence and outright fraud in many cases. I think in some cases, the information transmission and reporting mechanism was broken. And of course, there was, a lot of discussion about the initial days in Wuhan and why that information didn't get to the people who could act on it more aggressively sooner. And I think that there was a real learning experience from that. So there is something about making sure you've got the decision-making where everyone who's affected feels like it's okay for them to step up and say, hey, this could be really bad. I may be wrong, but I would rather be wrong and have us investigate it. And a lot of organizations are, very hierarchical. You see a lot of talk about flat management structures these days, which I think, are also, much more efficient. You're not, paying for all these unnecessary levels of management, but you need to make sure that everybody in the decision-making body has agency, that they've got the power to say something and they will at least be listened to. And I think that is missing in a lot of government bureaucracies, where there's often the sense of this is how we've always done things, and that's why they muddle. It's because this is how things are done is what is in people's heads, instead of the kind of diagnosing, what does it take to solve the problem huge, huge mindset shift. In the United States, the current occupant of the White House was very open. It had been quoted many, many times saying, if we don't test, then the numbers won't come out. He was concerned about his reelection prospects. So if you don't test, there's no problem. Which obviously, as scientists and fans of science, your audience knows is absolutely ridiculous. That part of the way that you solve the problem is by testing. So there was definitely deliberate cover-up in the United States. We just saw in Florida a woman who was charged with a lot of the data reporting and visualization was fired because she refused to fake it. I've seen reports here and there from other countries of people who tried to hide the problem. So it's not just one country. Some countries learn from their mistakes and are moving forward. In the United States, I think we've got a real battle between the people who believe in science and who are proactive and want to solve problems, and people who are just overly politicized and don't want to solve problems. I think some of it is a cost-benefit miscalculation, that people are saying, well, if we go back to work, everything's going to be fine. And they don't understand that bringing things back to normal too quickly is actually going to hurt the economy. There's a legitimate debate at times over, rural areas where there's little exposure between people. And that's a whole other issue, is that, how do you design policies differently for urban and rural areas? But just, I think in general, people don't understand the risks enough. And this goes back to the Argentina-Greece example that inspired the book. About 9 months before Argentina's collapse, there was a proposal to do a write-down, to reduce the debt. Banks would take a loss of about 30%. And I wrote about that, and a bunch of bankers called me and they said, we think that's what needs to happen, but we can't say it publicly or we're going to be fired. Because the calculus was, well, of course we're going to get all of our money back. Why would we give up 30%? And of course, things went out of control and they ended up losing 70% instead of 30%. And so that miscalculation of the options is, I think, very, very similar to some of the debates about, reopening too soon, going back to normal too soon. Yet we all want to go back to normal too soon. What we need to be thinking about is how to continue to support the people who are most vulnerable, who are hurt the most, when instead, the people who are benefiting the most are the people who've got money in the stock market in the United States. That, our safety net is broken, and the sooner we can get people who are most vulnerable to be safe, then the sooner the economy is going to bounce back. And that's just missed in all of this.
Absolutely difficult topics. I think you hit the nail on the head when you talked about how to lift the lockdown safely, because everyone's raring to go back to work. They say if they can't go back to work, there'll be a problem, with regard to having no money that they need. And the other option would of course be keeping the lockdown a little bit longer. So there's so much to think about. And absolutely, Michele, I do read your reports, and every year you list the top Gray Rhino risks of the year. I've seen your 2020 list, and it includes financial fragility, climate change, and global inequality. I think we are almost halfway through 2020. Can you give us some predictions of what 2021 will look like? By the way, on that note, I have one suggestion to add to that list. I'm proposing one idea. Do you think that mental health should be on that list? Because what I've been reading about is that they say after the COVID pandemic, we will see another pandemic, and that of mental health issues relating to whatever happened this year. Healthcare workers and people who got sick, or people on lockdown, etc. What do you think?
We absolutely are going to see a lot of that. There's a heartbreaking story here in Chicago. A few weeks ago, there was a party that the police busted and broke it up, and it was like a bunch of people with no masks, whatever. They've had to break up a lot of these parties here. It turned out that it was the son of a healthcare worker who'd been working incredibly long hours, had no idea about the party, and the city fined her for the party she didn't know about, which was like her son was so incredibly disrespectful. I think a lot of people are going to be struggling with this. And I think mental health is one of the things that doesn't get as much attention as it needs because there's a lot of stigma around it. Where, the question, if you're struggling with depression and, don't want to go on pills, like I've got a lot of friends who are in that case, the question is asked, if your eyes are bad, do you get upset and angst-ridden about whether you're going to get glasses or not? No. Why should it be any different with mental health? And, and part of the problem is that there are some really bad practitioners out there who, spoil it for everybody else. But mental health is definitely a part of this. I don't know if you've heard about these, Deaths of Despair, really good book about that. Very similar to the opioid crisis that we've had in the United States. The list that I come up with every year is actually a meta-analysis. I've got very strong ideas on my own about what the biggest problems are, and they really are in this sort of triad of financial fragilities and equality and climate change, and the way those three interact with each other. But the list that I do is really a compilation of, this year I think it's about 6 top risks, predictions, outlooks, forecasts, whatever you want to call them. It's a little bit like comparing not just apples and oranges, but also pears and kiwis and bananas and dragon fruit and you don't know what. But looking through these lists and kind of compiling them, which is as much art and science because it's just very hard to match them all up. But think what is keeping people up at night? What are they worried about? Because I really want us to be able to keep track of these obvious problems and then add a component to that of what are the leaders of my country doing about this? What, the business leaders, the government, and then also individuals. I think it's so important. You get this ridiculous ideological debate in the States about it's the government's responsibility. It's the business responsibility. It's, it's people. There's this whole stupid climate change debate about, well, you shouldn't stop eating meat or change your diet or take public transportation because, doing that takes the pressure off of the government and the businesses to do what they're supposed to do. That's ridiculous. Governments, businesses, citizens, whether it's individuals or civil society, everybody needs to be doing what they need to be doing to fix the problem. And we all need to hold ourselves and others accountable when we're not dealing with these issues. It's just, there's just a real lack of accountability. And I really hope that the Gray Rhino provides a system, a sort of way to track some of these things. There have been some very successful tracking initiatives around the world, like, Transparency International on corruption. Governments look at this and some of them have changed their behaviors to try to get higher on the list. And we should be doing the same thing with Gray Rhinos.
So, at this point, I want to invite some of our audience here to ask live questions. Do we have any raised hands? Maybe we can invite you to, I'm just going to invite anyone who has a raised hand to ask a question. So maybe I'll go with one more of my questions, and then you have time to think of questions to ask. My question is, and because I love books, I'm just going to ask a really important question. This is for me. When are we going to get the next book, Michele?
I'm actually very, very close to finishing it, and
really,
knock on wood. You hear me knocking on wood here, just to be sure. It's supposed to come out in China this fall.
Wow.
China and Taiwan this fall, and then in the U.S. tentatively January of next year. I didn't want to bring out a book at the same time as the election. The Gray Rhino came out in the U.S. in 2016. The week of the New York primary, which was the first time in the history of that primary that it had ever been relevant to anything. So even though I had a standing room only launch at the Barnes & Nobles on the Upper West Side, it was so hard to get media. And all my friends who had books come out that year just said, it's impossible. Like, Trump took all the air out of the room. So I learned, I'm like, I am not bringing out a book during an election again. And then of course, China has been just, such a great audience that I also felt like I should, I should honor that by bringing the book out in China first, because that's where it caught on really big first.
But you probably are frantically revising it to include a chapter on COVID, right? This is a big story. Am I right?
It is. What I'm doing instead of a single chapter is actually integrating it throughout the book. So there's references in a bunch of the chapters. I've had to redo the introduction. But COVID has really changed a lot of our thinking about risk, making it so important to understand your individual risk preferences and why you make the risk decisions that you do. Are you wearing a mask to protect yourself? Are you wearing it to, virtue signal or vice signal, as our president seems to be doing? Or are you doing it to protect other people? What are your actual risk factors? It really forces us to recalculate the risks of everything and what we can do to lessen those risks. But then it raises such huge societal questions about the risk umbrella that our governments and nations and states are supposed to provide over us. This relationship between citizen and nation is based on the idea going way, 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 way back in history that, people get power in exchange for protecting their citizens or their subjects or whatever from risk. And I think that is badly, badly broken. And we need a big re-reckoning of that. And the other part is this question of moral hazard, that, when the government or whoever comes in to bail people out, you reward bad behavior. And you've got a hierarchy of cases here. Obviously, restaurant workers, healthcare workers, senior home residents and workers. This is not their fault. In so many businesses, it's not their fault. And governments have been recognizing that by sending out a lot of helicopter money. But at the same time, you also have a lot of debate in the States, and I'm sure in other countries too, about some of these giant corporations which had borrowed to be able to buy back their shares. In some cases, 96% of their free cash flow to buy back shares on the stock market, the giant government subsidized casino in the United States. And they were coming out wanting government bailout money. And so we're going to have a very, very big reckoning. And then in coming months, as a lot of companies that were not able to pay their debts out of their income, if they're borrowing more to pay their debts, those companies are not sustainable. We're going to see a lot of bankruptcies, both personal and corporate, and eventually I think possibly some sovereign defaults. And there are going to be some very, very hard questions about who you save, who you don't, how you do it, what debt you reduce and by how much, and how that impacts the economy. So there's just a whole other set of moral and practical and economic and political and social questions to be asked.
So I'm just going to get a bunch of questions. Actually, there's one nice question from Joshua Au. Joshua, would you like to ask your question live? Can I give you audio privileges? I'm going to give you audio privileges. Would you like to ask the question?
Hi, Juliana. Really delighted to have a chance to ask this. My question is that we've been through this again and again. I think in many organizations, some are more prepared, some are less prepared. So I wonder what's the role of building up the right organizational culture so that the next time when we do have a potential scenario, we are better equipped, we are more suited to respond. And at the same time, how do you know we are not overreacting, where we are moving toward paranoia, where we move into a state of fatigue? Because I think, for example, firemen, they train for war. And if war doesn't happen, they know that they need to moderate the way they prepare so that they don't burn out. So where do we move between complacency and burning out and reaching a state of paranoia? So that's my...
Thank you. Thanks, Joshua.
Those are both fantastic questions. On the organizational culture question, it's so important. And I think it starts with with self-awareness among the leadership, and real attention to the decision-making process, which voices get heard. In so many companies, if you go to the frontline workers, every single one of you could probably tell you what the biggest problems are that the company's facing. Do those opinions get all the way up to the C-suite? Not so much. And it also really depends on cultures. I've seen a very big difference between, Asian audiences and European and the United States, where people instinctively get what I'm talking about with gray rhinos in Asia. And people have said, these are things we've been worrying about. You just gave us an easy way to talk about this. In Europe, it's very, very big in the crisis response, disaster risk reduction, and increasingly in the environmental, social, and governance investing space. In the US, a lot of financial planning, military, and other policy sort of super fans exist, but I get so much more defensiveness here than in any other place. Well, we're Americans. If it's an obvious problem, of course, we're dealing with it because we're Americans and that's what we do. And we know better than the rest of the world what to do. And the first step then is, I think, really getting past this defensiveness and realizing that once you accept that, everybody's got these blinders on and that you need to be aware of them, you can fix them. It's sort of this, recognizing your vulnerability is a strength. And that is incredibly important. And it's very tied to this question of accepting input from other people, within your company, also making sure you're listening to all of your stakeholders, because listening to other people for advice involves a certain amount of vulnerability and uncertainty. You don't know what it's going to be, and it might make you change your position. So those are really the two big things. And then on this question of not overreacting, it's interesting, in another workshop I did, this guy, he proposed the term limping hippos for things that you think are really dangerous, but turn out not to be so much, because actually, supposedly hippos are actually more dangerous than rhinos. Although actually the mosquito is a bigger killer than both of them combined and then some. But so you're picturing this hippo with a cane that can't come at you very fast. And I think that's true. It goes back to what I was saying about counterfactuals. It's very hard sometimes to tell if something is real or not. But there's, I would say in the majority of cases, common sense can really guide you. At the same time, there's a limping hippo phenomenon that worries me quite a bit. And that is that politics 101 is that if your country is having trouble, if there's an economic crisis, whether you caused it or not, what do? You distract your citizens by blaming it on foreign countries, other countries whose goods you're buying because they're competing with your goods. Blame the other, blame the foreigner. Mm-hmm. And that's actually a very big theme of my first two books, which are more related to immigration. So that's something that we need to be very aware of. Again, something that once you're aware of, you can do a reality check. When you are aware of how much fake news is out there, when you are aware that the more outlandish something sounds, the more likely you are to believe it and share it, then you can do a little, reality check. Check the source, check to see if it's corroborated other places. Does this make sense? So there's I think some trust building around information that's going to be a big part of keeping us from being paranoid about things that aren't really there.
That was a good one, Michelle. I see a hand that has been up for a while. I'm going to give you audio. Please ask your question.
Hello, thank you, Michelle. I just have a questions that I'm wondering, how is your perceptions on inequality? So even in normal times, the poor are very affected, and then they cannot really prepare themselves for this upcoming crisis, right? Especially when we see like the inherent inequality in the world right now. The more well-to-do are able to reap all the profit, and when they are going into a crisis, they are so better prepared to shelter themselves. So what is your perception on this, and how can we tackle this together?
Thank you, Doris.
So important. And, you know, as I mentioned, inequality is one of the top 3 kind of big global issues that just scares me. And I think it's going to be getting worse. You know, Kai-Fu Lee has written about this, about how technology is allowing companies to make more money with less investment and fewer employees. So you're getting a much, much bigger level of profits. And we're seeing that. And you've been seeing a debate over, you know, should we tax robots? And, you know, my take on that is maybe not necessarily tax robots, but tax this, you know, sort of abnormal profit. However you decide, you know, profits above a certain level get taxed at a higher rate. And that goes to, you know, subsidize other people. It's become so clear in this pandemic. And the other part of this inequality that I think that the people with the purse strings really don't get is that the research shows that if you need to stimulate an economy, you need to get money into the hands of the people who don't have discretionary income, who couldn't prepare ahead of time. So that's, you know, getting helicopter money to the people at the bottom of the pile, because they're actually going to take that money and go out and spend it, instead of the very richest are just going to put it back into the stock market. And, you know, actually right now, I'm very concerned that so much money is going into the stock market that it's not going into the real economy. And that house of cards is all going to come tumbling down. So it's hugely important. These are all related to each other. And we're really not doing the right thing. We've seen so many warnings on this. You know, Thomas Piketty's fantastic work is a huge part of political debate in the United States. And so I think that, you know, reducing inequality needs to be top priority for all governments. We've had central banks printing money that has made people with financial assets hugely richer in the past decade. And that hasn't gone to the rest of the population. And it's going to bring economies down. So it's not just a matter of, as they were talking about last year, you know, they're going to come after you with pitchforks. It's like, it's in the rich people's best interest to keep everybody in a state where they can continue to spend and support the economy.
Well, that's for another conversation, isn't it? It'll take another hour for us to talk about that. Anyway, we've since run out of time. Michele, thank you so much for joining me as a guest. It's 8 a.m. and now close to 9 a.m. Chicago time. So you woke up early for this talk. Thank you. You know, I would have had a chance to see you at some of the WEF events, the World Economic Forum events, but all of them have been canceled. So I'm just looking forward to when they resume and we can meet again. For those of you who enjoyed our session today, we will be publishing a recording of this session on our Asian Scientists YouTube channel. So please subscribe to us to stay connected. There are many more coming up. For example, next week we'll be speaking with Dr. Gia Sison. She's a Filipina mental health advocate and physician. She's also a breast cancer survivor, and she will be discussing the topic of mental health in a COVID pandemic, which is why, Michele, that I brought it up as well. You know, I'm very interested absolutely in that topic. So
and I'm so glad you're paying attention to it. There's actually a bit on it in the new book, so you can look out for that.
Getting ready to, you know, buy it off Amazon. So thank you, Michele. Thank you, everyone. Signing out. Goodbye.